McMaster is hosting the session today, and I want to thank Peter Cahill for facilitating today's session. Peter's a PhD student and physiotherapist in rehab science, and I'm going to let him take it from here.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Parker. So I was able to recruit two people who I consider superb qualitative researchers who I have the opportunity of working with on a more regular basis. So we have a panel version today. So first we'll hear from Dr. Sandra VanderKaay and then Dr. Stella Ng about how to improve the quality of our qualitative research. So first we'll start with Dr. Sandra VanderKaay, who is an occupational therapist who has a background in pediatrics. She's currently a post-doctoral fellow at the CanChild Centre for Childhood Disability Research, which is at McMaster University. There she also coordinates the Qualitative Query group for the School of Rehabilitation Science, which brings together students and faculty members and also external experts to discuss and exchange ideas about qualitative research methods. She's interested in theory building and ethical decision-making, are some of the projects she's currently working on. And thank you so much, Sandra, for being with us today and sharing your expertise.
Thank you, Peter, for your kind words and your introduction. And also thank you, everyone, for attending. Peter said that I could talk about anything. So I decided to talk about controversies and scandals in QR. But really, that's my spicy title. But my real title is just considering some common tensions in qualitative research and some potential considerations or solutions. And once I actually got the presentation done to a point where I was okay with it, I realized my title should actually be Quality and Qualitative Research, More Questions Than Answers. So if that gives you any idea of what's to come, I don't know. So I'm going to start just with going over the questions that I think this presentation will be answering and providing a simplified answer. So the first question I'll address is there a clear definition or consensus of understanding regarding quality in qualitative research? And I think the answer to that is no. Are quality and rigor the same thing in qualitative research? And again, the answer is no. Is there one cogent taxonomy of concepts and terms related to quality in qualitative research? Again, the answer is no. And are quality checklists valuable in guiding and assessing QR? And the answer is yes and no. So I think so far this slide supports my title number 3, but anyway, we'll see as we go. I thought it would be important to start just with giving you a background of my experience with qualitative research, what I've done as a principal investigator or a member of a research team. Just to let you know that my presentation today will obviously draw on my own experiences. As you can see, I've had little to no experience with ethnography or critical approaches to qualitative research, so I won't be speaking to those as specifically today, but my examples will draw on my own personal experiences. So I'm going to highlight 3 basic tensions in qualitative research. Really, what is quality? And part B to that question is, are quality and rigor the same thing? Those are 2 terms that are used interchangeably often. I'm going to talk about terms overload, and I'm going to touch briefly on qualitative checklists. And I just wanted to say that although I do tend to try to use humor, corny as it is, conducting high quality qualitative research is imperative, and it is never in question in my presentation. And I also wanted to mention that I've created the presentation in such a way that I am trying to stimulate informed decision-making, as opposed to presenting any dichotomies between good and bad, right or wrong, in conducting qualitative research. So before I go, I just wanted to get some help from the people attending. And if anyone wanted to drop in the chat box or unmute your mic and let me know what your definition of quality in qualitative research would be. So how might you define it?
I can go ahead and say something. Hi, Sandra.
Hi, Elaine.
So this is a comment that's coming from a reviewer on one of our qualitative studies. So one of the quality index in this reviewer's comment was whether or not it truly reflects the participants' experience, or are we interjecting our interpretation as researchers into how we analyze and report our data. Obviously, different types of qualitative methodology acknowledge different roles of the researchers in research, but seems that to some reviewers, being true to the data from your participants' perspective is important and is an indicator of quality. Definitely, Elaine. That is definitely one aspect of quality for sure. And it's interesting that that was raised by the reviewer as an indicator of overall quality. Thank you so much. A match between methodology and methods. So methodological congruence is one indicator of quality, definitely. Thank you, Laura. Melissa, I think you can't have quality without a rigorous approach, but you can pursue a study rigorously, but it may not be a quality research question. Definitely. So there's aspects about the research question. Can you be rigorous in qualitative research? Exactly. So those are some facets to consider definitely when defining quality. Is there anybody else? What is quality in qualitative research overall?
I think for me, increasingly, I'm thinking of it as a true depth of understanding in whatever that methodology and its originating paradigms are, because I think we can increasingly, as qualitative research becomes more and more popular, we're seeing happen to it the same thing that happened to quantitative approaches. Now anybody can download some checklist approach and apply the methods without truly understanding the orientation, the paradigms, the disciplinary history behind it. And you can, as a reviewer, sense that quality difference between the checklist versus deep approach.
That's really interesting, Stella. So you would say that does the study reflect a true depth of understanding of qualitative research broadly and that methodological approach specifically? That I think is excellent. Thank you for sharing that. I searched the literature to try to find one definition overarching of what do we mean as qualitative researchers when we're putting that label on our paragraph that says quality. And there actually, I wasn't able to find one. There wasn't a clear definition of quality. There was an acknowledgement that attending to quality means, is the study good? Is the study bad? And there's many aspects of quality defined in the literature. So Elaine, you mentioned some aspects of quality, which is, does it represent the participant voice? Are the findings reflective of the data? So those are aspects of quality, definitely. And we'll talk more about that in intention too. But there lacks an overarching definition. I think this is problematic in qualitative research, that we aren't really sure what we mean fully when we say quality. So what I did is I went to Merriam-Webster and I saw that the term quality meant degree of excellence. And in Cambridge Dictionary, the term quality meant how good or bad something is, and is it of a high standard. So then I started reflecting on, what do I mean when I say quality in qualitative research? And I thought, well, to me, it means, have I, as the researcher, ensured the highest standard? Again, it's a vague definition. I really like some of the other comments that were made, and I think they could be incorporated. Okay, what is happening with my mouse? Okay. So the sub-tension within this tension of the definition of quality and what do we mean is that people often use the term rigor. And you will see this even in qualitative papers where instead of having a heading that says quality, it says rigor. This was an interesting quote by Cypress, and she said, the term qualitative rigor is itself an oxymoron, considering that qualitative research is a journey of explanation and discovery that does not lend to stiff boundaries. So the term rigor is generally associated with positivist epistemologies, and we know that qualitative research does not fit within a positivist paradigm. And rigor often refers to reliability, validity, generalizability in quantitative research. So in qualitative research back in the 80s, Lincoln and Guba replaced this idea of rigor with trustworthiness. So again, although quality and rigor are often conflated, quality refers to the umbrella of how well this research has been done. And rigor, when it is used, is meant to be one aspect of quality. But trustworthiness is actually the qualitative term for rigor. And we're going to talk more about trustworthiness in tension number 2. So you can see here how several terms are being conflated and confused. And I think that relates to the lack of clear definitions in the qualitative research literature. Because then I went and tried to find a definition of trustworthiness. So if we're not going to use the word rigor, because that is a positivist term, we'll use the term trustworthiness. What does that mean? I found 2 definitions, and one was, are the findings worth paying attention to? And has the research been carried out correctly? So some of those undertones of what we already said about quality. So trustworthiness includes credibility, dependability, confirmability, and transferability. And I'm going to define these when I talk about tension 2. But on this sort of part, I wanted to just highlight even the term trustworthiness. It is not very well defined. So tension 1, in summary, we know that quality in qualitative research is the overarching idea. Trustworthiness is one way of measuring quality, and trustworthiness is sometimes referred to as rigor. In consideration of some of these tensions, I think it's important as qualitative researchers to reflect on how terms will be used within our study, to use the term quality, trustworthiness, and rigor intentionally, to seize opportunities to explain why you might be using these terms. So why are you saying trustworthiness over rigor? How is quality different from rigor? And also employ critical reflexivity to determine the underlying assumptions for continued use of the term rigor. So sometimes I feel that we use those quantitative terms to increase the acceptability or the credibility of our research. And ultimately, I think that doing so sometimes doesn't promote the uniqueness of the qualitative approach. Peter, you know about all my soapboxes, which I'm going to avoid getting on today. But I think it's just really important to be critically reflexive about, why are we choosing the terms we're choosing around quality in qualitative research. The second tension I want to talk briefly about is terms overload. So I had a word cloud here. The colors don't mean anything, and neither does the size. It's just a free word cloud maker on Google. but we have substantive completeness, triangulation, rater reliability, moral defensibility, methodological congruence, consistency. We have richness of meaning, thick description. What do these terms mean? There are so many terms in qualitative research to define quality. The terms can be complex, they can be confusing, very, very jargony, and often, not often, but sometimes contradictory. So we find ourselves as qualitative research saying, are we doing peer debriefing or are we doing analytical debriefing with peers? Are we using a decision-making tree or is this an analytical memo? Is it an audit trail? So there's terms that are used in the same way and they're named differently, and that can be confusing and contradictory. This is a common problem in qualitative research. I've made a chart here of the main terms that I think relate to most qualitative research approaches. So as I said on a previous slide, trustworthiness, or the rigor of qualitative research, comes down often to credibility, dependability, confirmability, and transferability. So Elaine, for example, you'll see transferability includes thick description. So the degree to which the results can be transferred by the user to other contexts and settings. And one way of ensuring that is to provide thick descriptions. Credibility is the confidence that we can have in the veracity of the findings. And we can confirm credibility by commenting on prolonged engagement, triangulation, analytical debriefing with peers, and member checking. So, so I won't go through each of them, but I just also wanted to point out, so even some of these terms within trustworthiness have many, many meanings and many sub terms. So for example, in triangulation, there is triangulation of data methods, triangulation of researchers. Member checking is sometimes, I can't even think of it off the top of my head, but what do we sometimes call member checking? I'm just gonna go to my, whoops, sorry. I'll just find it in my notes. I won't get caught up on it now, but the point is just to say that many of these terms have other terms to describe them and subterms to further describe those. So I think these are the four main concepts in trustworthiness. I wanted to point them out, and trustworthiness or rigor is the most common way of measuring quality in qualitative research. But in summary, for this tension, I wanted just to highlight that there are many terms and concepts used in QR to measure and report quality. Most commonly trustworthiness, and trustworthiness includes credibility, dependability, confirmability, and transferability. But as a consideration, so what's the point of highlighting this issue? It's very, very important as qualitative researchers that we become familiar with the terms and definitions. I myself have reviewed papers where I think that this was an afterthought and terms weren't necessarily used correctly. I think we have to be thoughtful about the terms we use and how we're defining them within our study and be clear about that. I think we have to choose terms that best suit our methodology. So for example, Sally Thorne for interpretive description doesn't talk about triangulation. Instead, she talks about something very similar, which is substantive completeness. So I think we have to be sensitive to the methodology we're using and the terms and references for quality that are built into that methodology. I think we have to also consider the target audience and the project. So sometimes, depending on where we're planning to publish, we can't necessarily use substantive completeness. We may have to say triangulation. Those are all things that we have to consider. But I think the important thing is to be prepared to educate and defend. So if we are called on by a reviewer to say, why did you say transferability and not generalizability? Or where's the generalizability in this study, that you have the knowledge to educate about why you're using the quality terms and measures that you are using. So the final, sorry, I know this is a really high level overview, but the final tension I wanted to talk about is the use of quality checklists. So in the last several years, quality checklists and standards for qualitative research have increased exponentially. The use of quality checklists is debated within the qualitative research world, obviously because of the deductive nature of use of checklists, where qualitative research typically is more inductive. The common qualitative checklist that most people have seen, of course, is probably the Core Q, which was actually originally developed for focus groups and interviews. And it sort of seems to have been applied more broadly with other research methods, and that's obviously problematic. When quality checklists were originally designed, they were developed mostly as publication standards, but they've also been taken up to guide qualitative research. And I've done this myself, where I've looked for publication standards to guide my methodology. This is an example of the Core Q. So I think by looking at this, you can see that not all of these items would relate to many qualitative research studies. And this is one of the issues when we're using checklists deductively, that many of the aspects of the checklist don't necessarily resonate with what we're doing inductively as qualitative researchers. So I decided to talk about, well, what are the pros and cons of using checklists? And obviously the pros are to offer guidance to researchers. I've used them in that way. They're great for journal reviewers to assess a manuscript, particularly if as a reviewer you don't have a lot of experience with qualitative research. It's been said that they establish standards for conducting and reporting qualitative research. So hopefully this will help to improve overall the quality of qualitative research being published. And it may increase the likelihood of getting a manuscript published. So those are some of the pros. The cons, obviously, here are that checklists were mostly centered on how to assess quality rather than achieve quality. We talked about the idea that checklists are deductive, while qualitative research is intended to be inductive. Checklists reduce flexibility with what the researcher can or cannot follow in their research. And one of the main issues is that there's a diversity of approaches in QR. So sometimes quality checklists don't reflect the diversity of approaches. As I said, the Core Q was developed for interviews and focus groups. It talks about data saturation, for example, but data saturation isn't relevant in some approaches. So for example, in realist approaches, we generally don't talk about data saturation because we don't try to attain data saturation. So it's really important to note that a checklist may not apply to all QR approaches. So in summary, QR checklists are gaining popularity. The Core Q is a common checklist, and there are several pros and cons to using checklists. But in doing so, as always, use them reflectively. Where possible, use methodology-specific checklists. So there's thematic analysis references there, realist references there, but there are many others. I think it's important always to draw on best practices for conducting your research in the literature, so that you're not necessarily relying on quality checklists, but that you're relying on the literature around that particular methodology to guide what you're doing. I think, as always, we have to have defensible reasons why we adhere or don't adhere to either checklists as a whole or specific aspects of a checklist. And I think it's so important to document all of your decision-making throughout the qualitative research process, so that if you are called upon by a reviewer to why or why not you did or did not do something that's consistent with a quality checklist, that you have that decision documented and you're very thoughtful around why you're making the decisions you're making throughout the research process. So that's all I wanted to say about quality. I'm sorry I've gone a little bit over what I wanted to, but I do have a few minutes for questions. And I'm sorry, I haven't seen the chat box.
Thanks so much, Sandra. That was really, really wonderful. I know I certainly have been guilty of using rigor and high quality interchangeably for qualitative research. And trustworthiness is a term I recognize but don't use. So this is like, I feel called out, but that's definitely good. So we did have one question from Dr. Parker in the chat, and if anybody else wants to unmute, or if you aren't comfortable unmuting, feel free to put it in the chat, and I can read it out for Dr. VanderKaay.
So I'm going to look at Dr. Parker's question. I think you can't have quality without, oh, that was a previous remark. Do you think part of the issue with terms overload relates to the diverse fields qualitative researchers come from? Yes, I absolutely agree, Dr. Parker. And this definitely speaks to my concern about things like checklists and standardized approaches, because methodologies are so unique in and of themselves that it's really hard to apply broad terminologies and broad checklists on particular approaches. So I definitely do think that that is an issue. So we try to have sort of ideas for qualitative research as a whole, but then we have to be flexible in applying those ideas in a way that's responsive to the methodologies that we're using. So great point, and I wholeheartedly agree. Any other questions or comments?
I have a question, Sandra, if that's okay.
Hi, Wenonah.
Hi, Sandra. Thanks so much for a really helpful presentation, and so much of it did resonate with me. I will have to pick your brain afterwards in other places around how to use this information. But the question I have is, you know, for a long time, it seemed like we talked about you had to choose when you were coming up through your training that if you're going to be a quantitative researcher or a qualitative researcher, and you take a certain path, and then, you know, you either go on to do qualitative research or you go on to do quantitative research. And I think, we've seen a rise in people doing mixed method research, so they need to bring together both, and that's been recognized as having, well, pros and cons, but it's a reality that it's growing. But also it seems that researchers are talking much more about asking the research questions that matter, rather than saying, well, I'm a quantitative researcher, so I can only ask quantitative research questions, and vice versa. So as a PI, I often find myself sometimes asking quantitative research questions and sometimes asking qualitative, but I'm not necessarily an expert in, say, qualitative. So how do you get into this and answer meaningful research questions if you didn't do that training? Can one, should one, what would one do if one wants to ask a question, but you didn't take all those courses when you were coming up through? And I ask that because many people on the line are trainees and might be wondering the same thing.
That's a great point, Wenonah. Thank you for raising it. And I think that I am a kind of a diehard QR person. And I agree with you, though, that sometimes those silos prevent us from asking research questions that might need to be asked, because we might not have the skill set to ask that particular question. I definitely ran into this in my PhD, where I had to actually do a quantitative component because the question needed to be answered quantitatively. I think I can't speak to quantitative research because I think it requires a very in-depth skill set, and I think it's more difficult to pick up. I think qualitative research, one can learn. I mean, I think there's so many quality references. So if you want to do interpretive description or grounded theory, one can learn it. I think a quantitative research can learn qualitative. I think what sometimes happens is quantitative research becomes somewhat of an afterthought, or it becomes this idea like, okay, yeah, let's just interview people, and that there's not much to it. And that's where you see poor qualitative research. So I think you can build, obviously you're very good at building teams with a variety of expertise, but I definitely think there's nothing in qualitative research that cannot be learned. But I think it's important to know that it needs to be learned and understood, and that it can't just simply be applied, which I think sometimes happens when people apprehend that there is a qualitative research component to their question, but they might not have the skills. So I think it's just an appreciation that both quantitative and qualitative have a role in responding to many research questions, and that both need to be well done in response to that question. I don't know if that's addressed your remarks, Wenonah.
It does. Thank you so much, Sandra. And I see Stella has popped a really good comment in there as well. And I'm mindful as well that Peter has, actually, maybe that's a great transition over to Stella. Thanks so much, Sandra.
Thank you.
So yeah, in the interest of time, unfortunately, I guess I will have to cut this conversation short, but so we can also hear from Dr. Stella Ng, who is a pediatric audiologist by background. She's also now the Director of Research at the Center for Faculty Development and holds the Arel Family Chair in Health Professions at St. Michael's Hospital in the University of Toronto. She's a scientist as well at the Center for Interprofessional Education, as well as the Wilson Center. She also is an associate professor of speech-language pathology at the University of Toronto. And in her work, she's interested in exploring very complex and value-conflicted work environments in order to support professionals in delivering compassionate, ethical, and reflective care. Thanks so much, Stella, for being here today and to share your perspective on this topic with us.
Thank you. And I apologize, although I have been a part of this group's discussions before, I'm not really a part of this group. And so forgive me if I go a bit rogue. But I'm wondering, I have to say, you know, one marker of quality is often when there's some kind of alignment and consistency. And Sandra and I talked before this, but did not really plan closely together. And a lot of what I was going to say, though slightly different, is actually repetitive. So in the interests of going rogue, I want to spend some time diving into something that will require some participation actively. Is that okay in this group? Okay. So I will share my screen. Okay, so, you know, you can even see that it would have been repetitive. We were going to talk a bit about alignment from paradigm to perspective to question through to methodology and methods. But what we can do now, given a lot of what I was going to say has been said, is spend more time on an activity. So are you able to do breakout groups, Peter, or not? Either's fine.
I'm actually not sure. I'm not the actual host of the meeting.
I think that might be a bridge too far.
Okay. We won't do breakout rooms. We will just do a large group discussion. So I'm going to show a case. I'm actually going to read it. I'm going to act it out. I will be both the researcher as well as a child participant in a research study. This comes out of a paper which is referenced on the slide that follows. And then what we're going to do is consider this to be a real moment in your own qualitative research practice. You're the interviewer. And we're going to reflect together on what we would do. My hope is, as my intro slide says, that we can address this idea of what is good qualitative research through reflexivity. And I would argue, like Sandra, that rigor is not the best term, and that quality and ethics in qualitative research are inextricably linked. And so to achieve both, you have to achieve the other, and you have to be reflexive. So here is the scenario. So I will act this out, and I am not a good actor, so please bear with me. Shannon, the researcher, says to the child, "Do you think there's anything else that I would need to know about you?" And Sarah, the child, says, "Yeah." Shannon says, "Like what?" "I don't hang out with other kids a lot." "No?" "No, I'm kind of shy." "Kind of shy?" "Yep, I can't really open up to other kids. Let's just say that." "Okay." "Oh, I've been to," and then Sarah moves on to another topic. So I will stop sharing now and just ask the group to engage in a dialogue. What would you do if you were Shannon? You're the interviewer. You're trying to get to know child experiences with inclusion and disability. And that's how that went. I see someone in the chat saying, ask why she's shy, what makes her shy, what would help her to engage. Here, I can share it again so you can see. So as a starting question, would you have moved on and let that go? We're thinking about both quality and ethics at the same time. So Sandra says, no, you wouldn't have let it. Can you tell us what you would do as the researcher?
I was thinking, Stella, maybe, but I don't know how the study would be written, but maybe employing a different way of getting at the information besides just interview questions.
Okay. So maybe in that moment, you might have let it go, but you might have pursued another angle to get at what's holding Sarah back.
Yeah, I think I would have asked her, so like, can you tell me of a time when you were really shy and just tell me what happened? And I mean, like, we obviously don't know the age of the child, but I probably would have brought like puppets or dolls or something to help break down any shy barrier between an adult and a child, because that can also be awkward for little kids sometimes. And speak in a language that they understand, of course.
And so for the two people have said they probably would have tried to find out more. Would you have tried to find out more in the name of quality, or in the name of ethics, or both, or neither? Like, what's the rationale for digging more?
Well, I think the rationale for digging more is sorry, I'm just reading the slide again, is to really follow up with what we're trying to learn about her, because that was the initial question. And it was just such like a blasé, I'm shy, okay, and then just moved on. So there's no quality in understanding this child in any kind of psychological or social science point or an emotional capacity. It's just, this is a kid, she's shy, and we've moved on for a reason we don't know.
There's some great comments in the chat. Would have tried to revisit to better understand what the interactions look like. Validate the bravery. Ask if she wanted to talk about it. How old is the participant? So that's a really good question, and need to be cognizant that concerns may be uncovered that require follow-up beyond research. Absolutely. So that is one of the challenges often for this group. From what I know about this group, you have multiple hats in your professional life. You may be a practicing clinician of some type, and then when you're doing qualitative research, you're engaging in research practice that can sometimes start to border on what might feel like a clinical moment. And so how do you draw a hard line between, this is me, so Shannon's professional background is as an OT. This is me as a researcher versus this is me as an OT. And we have things like Research Ethics Board guidelines to help us draw those lines, as well as to help us provide and prepare to provide those additional resources that were mentioned. Like if you can see that a child is struggling and needs more help, there needs to be a plan in your research ethics board proposal for how you will actually address that. So I'll expand a bit now on that example. If you read the paper in more depth, you'll find that this was a very, very ethically important moment for the researchers and the research team. And the judgment call was made in that moment, which a couple of authors, Gwilym and Gilliam, have written about as the ethically important moments in everyday research practice. And so this is where it really relates to what Sandra was talking about in terms of tensions. So we have this tension of what our guidelines, our checklists, our protocols would tell us is right and what we should do. And then that in the moment reflexive practice as researchers. Research is a practice. And so we must be reflexive when we do it. And Shannon, the researcher in that moment, made an ethical decision not to probe, perhaps at the cost of getting really rich data. And richness of data can be a marker of quality in qualitative research. So perhaps it might have felt like a sacrifice of quality in that moment. But, you know, I'm trying to act this out. I wasn't actually there. When you read the paper, you learn that in the moment, it seemed, based on all the judgments that this researcher could bring to the situation, like it would be ethically inappropriate to push the child. The child made signs. She used body language to indicate she did not want to go there. She didn't want to talk about it in that moment. And pushing would be almost, out of self-interest for the research rather than for the considering the well-being of the child. And so this is where I really think that blend between considering quality and ethics comes up over and over in qualitative research. And so we can't really talk about those two pieces in isolation. And it highlights how for both, your work's not done with, your REB being approved and your protocol being approved by a team or a committee, but it is this ongoing process of continually considering what you're doing, whether it enhances the work, whether it harms, how it helps, who it helps. Are there any other thoughts on that? Should check the chat. Okay, so yeah, I like the focus from Jacqueline on if the research question is about inclusion, it's important to explore I don't hang out with other kids a lot. So yeah, that's something that is one of those in the moment considerations, to always have your research question in mind so that you don't deviate. One of the things I've experienced as I've moved from always being the one doing my own research to often being the one supervising research is that being a good high quality interviewer takes a lot of mentorship, training, experience, and practice. And I'll often, if I've failed as a mentor, I'll often see a transcript and think, this isn't quite it. We're not getting the kinds of data that we need to answer the research question. There are too many missed opportunities to probe and to prompt. And so I would say if this were an adult, if the body language wasn't there to indicate that Sarah did not want to talk more, then I would completely wholeheartedly agree that there were many missed opportunities to prompt and to probe, to target that research question and to get that rich data. And that is often an issue in qualitative research where quality can suffer. But yeah, in this particular instance, I think the ethics outweighed the pushing and the probing. But that is definitely open for debate. Any other thoughts on that? Or?
I wanted to add, I think it's can be helpful, especially with kids, to have some sort of like backup plans, whether it's like art or getting them to draw something, because they might not want to verbalize it, but they might be okay telling you in a different way too.
Absolutely. And in that actual study, they used photos. So the kids had been given cameras to take pictures, and then they were talking through the photos, which brings with it its own ethics and quality concerns. But it's such a good point. And I know a lot of people at Western and elsewhere are doing work on that and building that up. So I thought maybe we could dive a little more in these last few minutes. I know, Peter, you said you like to leave at least 10 minutes for discussion, like broad discussion as a group. So should I talk about one more thing, or do you want me to pause there and open it up?
No, I'd go ahead and talk about, it was more 5 minutes per presenter. So I think you have enough time.
Sorry, again, I went rogue.
Okay.
Okay, so let's talk a bit more then about reflexivity in particular. Like what is it actually? How do we define it? How is it different in research than in clinical practice? Because for those who don't know me, what I study is the role of reflection in everyday practice, in particular, critically reflective practice. And so when we talk about reflexivity in research, I think it can get confusing in terms of what we really mean. And one of the things that is fascinating is that reflexivity used to be considered an intractable problem of science, which I think we don't all realize in terms of the origins of the concept. So it was actually identified originally as this idea that we can't learn and push society through science because the way that we think, the questions we ask, and the way that we pursue those questions is all limited and constrained by our current understandings of the world. So we're kind of trapped in our own frame, and we're going to just keep going through this cycle of reproducing problems. This is why we see history repeat itself, and we tend to generate solutions to things that might not actually be solutions. They're just sort of band-aid fixes. And so this problem of reflexivity was reclaimed by social scientists as a way out of that loop. So if we agree with the philosophers and scientists who claimed reflexivity is a problem, that we're just going to stay stuck in this loop of knowledge production, the only way out is, this is the reclaiming part, to be reflexive. So not to be stuck in reflexivity, but to be reflexive, to understand that all of our knowledge and understanding is constrained by our current way of seeing the world. And only if we challenge the current frame, like the very foundations of what we think is best science, best evidence, can we actually transform knowledge and produce something new. So that's where reflexivity came from for research. It came from this idea that we need to challenge the assumption that science is right, science discovers new things, and we can all believe science. Challenge that assumption continually to make science actually be better, create new knowledge that helps and changes the world. So that's like this historical definition of reflexivity, but then what we get taught in qualitative research programs is really how to do reflexivity, or maybe what the purpose of reflexivity is. But I always like going back to that history because I think it reminds us that reflexivity should not be constrained to qualitative research. It should be something that is applied globally to the entire enterprise of science. And we can see how important that would be to our current society and the way that we're seeing, anti-science, and then we try to counter anti-science. And if we aren't reflexive about how we counter anti-science, we actually create more polarization. So that's my soapbox. I know Sandra promised not to go on her soapbox, but I made no such promises. Okay, so then what is reflexivity in qualitative research? It's a process whereby researchers place themselves and their practices under scrutiny, acknowledging the ethical dilemmas that permeate the research process and impinge on the creation of knowledge. So here again is where the connection between ethical research practice and quality research practice are inextricably linked, because ethical dilemmas can impinge on the creation of knowledge. And I really like how in this definition, they focus on reflexivity upon yourself and your practices. And so often in published research papers, we'll see the section called reflexivity. And in that section, it usually will say something like, the research team was comprised of an occupational therapist, a psychologist, and a school-based team. You know, it'll just tell people what the roles were. And so people do this because there are constraints within journals for how many words you can have and how many of those words should be dedicated to your reflexivity section. But the idea that your reflexivity can be condensed into a little paragraph about who you all are is, you know, a little bit silly. And so what this definition highlights on the overall paper is that it's really about scrutinizing those practices, the practices and the assumptions that underpin them. Why are we doing things in this way? What could we be doing differently? Who are these practices helping and who are they harming? So in that initial case that we reviewed, again, Shannon could have pushed Sarah, but who would that ultimately be serving? And then the many, many excellent ideas that were raised could enhance quality while still preserving the ethics. So you could pursue that, the piece that Shannon let go in terms of the pursuit of knowledge could be pursued in other ways with other participants in other moments. She could have circled back to Sarah later on in the interview. It could have come up through other forms of data like observation. So there are many different ways to balance the ethics and the quality piece. And then this is an excellent resource is Finley. Finley writes a lot about reflexivity and talks about how it examines the impact of the position, perspective, and presence of the researcher, which again is too often where qualitative researchers will stop, often because of journal constraints. It promotes rich insight, opens up unconscious motivations and implicit assumptions in the researcher's approach, evaluates the research process, method, and outcomes, and enables public scrutiny of the integrity of the research by offering a methodological log of research decisions. That one's a little bit difficult with some research approaches, but can still be helpful in some cases. And then I'll just skip because, again, I think Sandra did such a wonderful, thorough job on problematizing rigor for qualitative research. I'll skip to this piece here, which I think is so important. And it relates to one of the comments I put in the chat during our discussion for Sandra's talk. A lot of, you know, qual-quant language gets used as though you are a qualitative expert or you are a quantitative expert. And some people are. Some people are very well versed in all of the different methodologies and methods that exist in one of these kind of dichotomously divided research enterprises. But ultimately, each specific approach has criteria of its own that help you judge its quality. And I just put two quick examples. So constructivist grounded theory is extremely popular in qualitative health research. And if you're using Sharmaz's approach to constructivist grounded theory, she has specific criteria that she writes about. And I'll often review a paper and see people citing the generic quality criteria from Guba and Lincoln or some such, but not addressing Sharmaz's, which are described here. And then another one that I know can often both trouble people and also really resonate with people is this idea of the phenomenological nod. So if you're doing a phenomenology study, which is about the essence of a lived experience, there is this idea that if you share back your findings with a group of people who has lived that experience. So let's say you're studying the lived experience of going through the grade school to high school transition as a child with disability. When you share that back, others who have lived that experience should be like, yes, that richly describes what it's like to live that as a person with disability. And this is also challenging because, you know, the whole idea of phenomenology is looking at essence, and essence can essentialize. So you can end up oversimplifying the complex and diverse lived experience of a whole group. And so again, this is where quality butts up against ethics, and we need to reflexively navigate it. So we can't accidentally think that, well, this study was done, so every single person with cerebral palsy lives this experience. at the same time, it should be rich and descriptive enough that people would nod along and be like, yeah, I get that. That represents my experience. So maybe I will just leave it on. Just some references people can jot down if interested. And yeah, 5-minute discussion, even though I went rogue.
Thanks, Stella. No, that was no problem. And thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I actually had not heard of the phenomenological nod, and I've read a lot of phenomenology, so maybe that speaks to the quality of the phenomenology I've been reading. I did want to open it up for questions. Does anybody want to unmute or place anything in the chat? I see that Dr. Parker is asking if our presenters would be willing to share their slides. Excellent, thank you.
I had a question, and it's Jennifer Ryan. Can you hear me okay? The question actually just sort of builds upon some of the part that you were discussing, Stella, with respect to your supervision of students who are conducting interviews, and when you review the transcripts, you're sort of seeing these missed opportunities. And I'm just wondering, so I would say that I'm more of a quantitative researcher, but I have participated in some qualitative research, and would say that I'm probably could have been one of those students that missed a lot of opportunities. I'm just wondering how you take into consideration with the students those non-verbal things, the things that take place outside of the transcript, when you're getting the student to reflect upon how they could have or whether they should have probed more in some of their questions.
It's such a great question, and it relates to another moment where we need to be reflexive, and that's around considering authorship. And that might seem like a tangent, but it's relevant here because often with quant research, we say data collection doesn't in itself really set you up for authorship. But in qualitative, it absolutely can and does, because you're so interactive with what's being created. And so one thing I've started to do with students, two things. One is getting them to transcribe their own interviews, because I think many of us had to do that, and it was like, oh, I can't wait till I'm a real researcher with grants and I can pay someone to transcribe. But it's such a good opportunity to observe yourself in action, catch all the annoying things you say and do, realize you say like every 5 seconds, you know, and start to be able to correct some of those things. And the other is I use this approach of 3 steps where I will do an interview with a student where they observe me interviewing. Then I will do one with them where we're kind of co-interviewing. And then I will do one where they do it and I'm there observing and only contributing as needed. I'll do those as pilots when appropriate, and when it's ethically safe to do so, I'll actually do them as real data collection. The piloting piece can be helpful too. And I would also say it just really highlights for me how with qualitative research, there are some distinct differences from quant, where you can't necessarily conduct a good interview without deep theoretical content knowledge of the study, because it's not just an instrument, a standardized tool. You need to know what to probe and how to probe, and to know that you probably need some of that theoretical background in the content area.
I was just going to add to that as well. I think the question, Jennifer, thank you, speaks to the importance of training qualitative interviewers around the use of field notes as well as such an important data collection tool. And I think sometimes that's forgotten in interviews. Really, the interviews are often being recorded, so there really isn't a pressure to necessarily transcribe what the participant's saying, but the note taking in the field needs to really be about some of those other more subtle things that are happening in terms of body language and pauses, and what are those pauses about, because the transcript will pick up the pauses or the laughter, but the field notes is really what captures the gut feeling of the interviewer in the moment when those things are happening, or immediately following the interview. So I think your question also just spoke to me about the importance of training interviewers on recording
field notes and the value of field notes in conducting qualitative interviews.
And that's exactly why we couldn't assess that case with Shannon and Sarah, because we didn't have that. We didn't have those recordings, you know, Shannon's notes that that child clearly did not want to talk about that. And so, yeah, that's huge. Thank you.
Right. So it looks like we are past 1 o'clock, so we should probably adjourn for now. But thank you so much, Sandra and Stella, for being willing to share your expertise. It's really exciting to actually hear your perspectives on these topics. I've been wanting to kind of get a more in-depth look at both of your perspectives on qualitative research for some time. So thank you so much for being willing to come speak with us today.
And thank you, Peter, for pulling this all together for us.
No problem.
Thank you, Peter, for the invitation. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
Happy Friday, everyone.